Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Shirley Bartz, Habitat Stewardship Coordinator with Nature Saskatchewan, will be speaking about plovers on shore, how landowners are conserving endangered piping plovers in Saskatchewan. Just a little bit of business before we begin. PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation, either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Check out the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org, for information about past and future presentations. All past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. Our next Native Prairie Speaker Series webinar is on Friday, February 28th. Join PhD candidate Janine Randall from the University of Northern British Columbia talk about how alternative grazing practices affect the diversity and abundance of grasslands birds. On March 20th, Medea Curtinu from Environment and Climate Change Canada will be talking about prairie butterflies. You can register for these webinars through our website. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our gold sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, Sask Energy, Sask Power, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Camp Wolf Willow and Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Inc., as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by Nature Saskatchewan. Today's webinar qualifies for continuing education credit with the Society for Ecological Restoration. Please contact us for details if this applies to you. And a reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about today's presenter. Shirley Bartz was born and raised far from the prairies. Whether she was backpacking in the Sierra Nevada mountains, cross-country skiing in the Los Padres National Forest, or rock hopping in the hoodoos of Joshua Tree, Shirley was always watching birds, chasing lizards, staring at bugs, and tracking mammals. Following her passion for studying living things, Shirley completed a Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Management, worked as a field biologist for 10 years, and then completed a Master's of Science in Biology. Shortly thereafter, she moved to Winnipeg and soon settled out of Regina. In the 13 years that she's been living in the prairies, she's found the rolling grasslands as comforting as the sage and chaparral of her native southwestern U.S. and takes a similar joy in feeling small under the prairie sky as she did on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Shirley delights in sharing her passion for stewardship of rare species and in reciprocal learning about conservation and restoration of native ecosystems. While her temporary position as Habitat Stewardship Coordinator, Shirley is looking forward to applying her experience, engaging with multi-use landowners, and monitoring species at risk. She hopes to continue working with Nature Saskatchewan long into the future. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Shirley.
How does that look?
That's perfect. We can see everything.
Excellent. Okay, so can I take it away, Caitlin?
Absolutely, go for it, Shirley.
Okay. Thank you all for coming today. It's great to be able to give a presentation from the comfort of my desk. I've got a couple of audio-visual aids here. I'm going to try and keep things kind of simple. I won't be able to hear any of you as my presentation is going on, so like Caitlin said, just send questions through that little message box. Okay, so my name is Shirley Bartz, and I am a Habitat Stewardship Coordinator here at Nature Saskatchewan, and today I'm going to be talking about piping plovers and conservation that is ongoing with them here in Saskatchewan. And I cannot move my cursor forward. That's exciting. There we go. Okay, so in this presentation, I'll be covering where and when piping plovers can be found in North America and physical characteristics that you can use to identify them. I'll talk about where piping plovers build their nests and how they raise their young. And I'll briefly describe where and how we came to know that piping plovers were endangered and why Saskatchewan is so important for their conservation. I'll describe some of the factors threatening the species, and that will take us into some of the work that's being done to protect them and conserve their habitat. And then I'll close with some suggestions of how you can take part. So let's start with where piping plovers live and how to distinguish them. They are a small shorebird. They're a migratory species that breeds here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta and all the way over to the eastern seaboard. They're native to North America, and they inhabit freshwater bodies that are sort of saline or places that have lots of sand flats. Oops, there we go. So their breeding range is populated by three sort of separate populations on the Atlantic coast and at the Great Lakes and through the northern Great Plains. And their winter range is down towards the Gulf of Mexico and the southern Atlantic coast. So how do you know if you're seeing a piping plover? One of the things to look for is that monobrow across its forehead and the orange and black tip, or the orange and black bicolored beak. It's also got one black ring around its neck, white belly, pale gray back, and orange legs. So there are some species that are sometimes confused with piping plovers. One of them is a killdeer, but you can pretty much see readily on killdeers that they have two black neck bands, and their legs are quite long and they're much more brown. Their beak is also completely black, and if you've got a really good camera or binoculars, you can usually see that red eye ring. Here is a piping plover beside a killdeer, and this is a smaller species of plover that is sometimes confused with piping plovers during the migration period, as you can see in the map in the lower left. Semi-palmated plovers are not present in the breeding area of piping plovers. It's just during migration that we might get some overlap. They also have a bicolored bill, but they also have quite a bit more black on their face and a bit more of a black mask. We might see snowy plover at the same time as piping plover, but it's only going to be in a couple of isolated locations in Saskatchewan during the breeding season. So who is this? Unless you're a birding expert, you would probably miss this guy, or unless you had some context with regard to the seasons and where you were seeing it. But this is actually a piping plover in its winter plumage. So they don't develop that bicolored bill until they're in full breeding plumage. Another thing you can look for in piping plovers is a white rump. So the back end of the bird is going to look very white. Now, I'm going to lose my voice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the breeding biology of piping plovers. They typically nest on broad sandy beaches, and the beaches have sand and shells and sticks, gravel, pebbles, fine-grained, and sometimes a few scattered rocks in there, and it's usually very low in vegetation, so just a few scattered clumps of vegetation. Piping plovers do not build a nest like other birds made of twigs or grasses. They make something called a scrape. The male bird will make this sort of professional tiler's version of a nest out of very carefully selected pebbles and stones. And it's in those pebbles and stones that the female will lay her eggs. Here's an example of how camouflaged or cryptic those nests can be. And here's an example of how small the piping plover's eggs are. That's a loony there. Just for comparison, here are killdeer eggs and semi-palmated plover eggs Sorry, I think I'm going to be losing little bits and pieces of the edges of my screen. So both of the male and female piping plovers incubate the eggs. If you're seeing one running around on the shoreline, there's not a great way of telling whether it's the male or female during the breeding season. If you see one on the nest, it could be either the male or the female. If the nest isn't disturbed, incubation lasts from 25 to 28 days, with peak hatching occurring during the middle of June. The chicks of piping plovers are precocial, which means that they are able to get up and run around a little bit like an antelope, pronghorn, or a deer baby. So within just a few hours of coming out of their eggs, their eyes are open, they're born with down, and within a few days of hatching, they are able to run around on the shoreline with their parents and feed. It does take them a little bit longer time to fledge than other birds that are not a shorebird or marine species. So a sparrow will fledge a bit faster than the piping plovers. Despite their baby's ability to run, piping plover parents are still very protective of them. They have this tendency to do something that's like a bull rush whenever there's a threat, and they're also really well known for their broken wing display to tempt a predator away from the nest. Now, these strategies wouldn't work very well if the chicks didn't know how to be inconspicuous. So when they hear their parents giving an alarm call, they lie down and do their best to look like a rock. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go over the timeline of the piping plover's history. I'm not going to read the next two slides, but I do want to draw your attention to a few details. First of all, piping plovers have been in trouble for nearly 70 years that we know of. And as conservation biologists and bird watchers became more aware of them, piping plovers went from threatened to endangered status in the US in less than 10 years. In 1990, it was well known that piping plovers were in trouble. And in 1991, the first international piping plover census was conducted. And as the data began to roll in, it was clear that there were actually two groups of piping plovers in North America. The genus and the species are still the same. It's Shirley melodus. But in the Northern Great Plains and Ontario, in the Great Lakes area, we had circumcinctus. And in the Atlantic coast, there was the melodus subspecies. I'm going to take this opportunity to mention to you folks that, as Caitlin noted in my introduction, I grew up in a different place than right here, and we called plovers plovers and not plovers. I hope that's not too distracting for you. And scientific names are in Latin, and I am probably pronouncing those names a bit differently than everyone else, but we'll see if we can get past that. So in 2003, piping plovers were listed as endangered on Schedule 1 of the Species at Risk Act in Canada. And in 2007, there was a recovery strategy and an action plan in 2009 that were developed, and that helped identify and designate critical habitat in Canada. And the international censuses continued every 6 years, and Nature Saskatchewan started up the Plovers on Shore program. So all of these data that were coming in increased our understanding of threats to piping plovers. So one of those first threats is that for a number of reasons, piping plovers have poor reproductive success. Despite being precocial, the chicks grow slowly. They have a low metabolic rate. They require frequent brooding before they fledge. And if brooding is interrupted, if the birds are disturbed, then that increases the chick's vulnerability to predators and to getting wet during cold or wet weather. And generally, the chicks will have a lower survival when there's disturbance that takes the adults off of their nest. So what kind of disturbance takes an adult off the nest or off its chicks? Well, it's usually humans walking around on the beaches, but some people say that increased human presence and the garbage that comes with us lead to increased scavengers and predators on the beaches. So those native predators are things like coyotes and corvids, crows and ravens. Exotic predators can be things like dogs or cats. Scavengers, which are, again, attracted by the garbage, are things like gulls and raccoons. Other threats can be things like high water in the springtime, following, presumably, a lot of snow melt. Although many of the participants that Nature Saskatchewan has in the Plovers on Shore program, which I'll mention later, mentioned that in 2019, many of the beaches where they'd seen piping plovers in the past were inundated. So we're going to talk a little bit about what might be causing that. When water is high during the summer, we can have nests get flooded. And sometimes when the water is low, we can have vegetation and plants colonize the shoreline where piping plovers are trying to nest. And for these visually vigilant species, those plants can hide predators. And so piping plovers may even avoid a beach where they're arriving and there are already plants beginning to grow. Online publications at the Important Bird Area, or IBA in Canada, note that the Quill Lakes have international, continental, and global significance to piping plovers. This is an image of the Big Quill Lake. Between 1991 and 2005, the breeding season saw between 43 and 440 piping plovers at Quill Lakes. Under the current conditions, though, with the flooding from high precipitation all the way back from 2017 and high levels of agricultural drainage from wetlands running into the Quill Lakes, this globally significant IBA isn't available to piping plovers. As you can see in this image there just aren't any beaches that are available to them there. As I mentioned earlier, piping plover chicks need to be brooded, and it's hard to stay snuggled up when mom and dad are out bull rushing and wing dragging a bunch of folks that are on the beach, or just running away from people. Another thing that can happen here in Saskatchewan and in other places where people have rangeland is that cattle can access the shoreline, and they have been known in some cases to trample nests inadvertently, and their hooves can just churn up the shoreline and cause something called hummocking and pugging, which are basically deep holes that piping plover chicks can fall into and have a hard time getting out of. There are also disturbances in the overwintering grounds down there along the Atlantic Gulf Coast and the Gulf of Mexico there. Those disturbances can include everything from the resorts that some of us love so much to garbage on the beaches that draw in scavengers and predators. The Great Lakes have had a lot of problems with pollution, changing the water quality. And there's also been oil development offshore that can risk spills that might threaten shoreline breeders. So, what is being done now to protect or to help understand what's going on with piping plovers? The Piping Plover Recovery Strategy was published in 2006, and its mandate was to identify actions that were needed to halt the decline of piping plovers. In order to halt their decline, they had to protect habitat and thereby increase productivity, and they had to address what they discovered was a lack of knowledge about critical habitat. So they set out to gather a bunch of data on critical habitat, and luckily for them, there had already been 3 international piping plover censuses. So they also tried to complete a rather ambitious task of learning about piping plover migratory movements and what was going on at their overwintering grounds. The federal government also rolled out an action plan in 2009 to achieve the goals of the recovery strategy. And these efforts resulted in the identification of 41 basins that were designated as critical habitat just in Saskatchewan alone. I'm going to briefly describe the International Piping Plover Census, which I'm just going to refer to as the census, that got underway in 1991. I'm going to start by talking about the benefits of this census. And we'll start that by going over the goals, which were to determine the population size and the trends of those populations of piping plovers throughout their range in North America, to measure the recovery program's success and identify critical habitat. There are a couple of numbers here that I'm going to flip through. We'll start with the world population of piping plover in 2006. After a few of those censuses, it was determined to be 7,651. And in the Northern Great Plains, the population in 2006 was 4,673. And in Saskatchewan, the population in 2006 was 1,435. So those numbers have come down, but the piping plover population in Saskatchewan was fully 31% of the Northern Great Plains and 19% of the world population. The take-home message here is that Saskatchewan's population of piping plovers is very important to conserve. So in case numbers aren't your thing, here are some pictures. The pink pie wedge is Saskatchewan's piping plover numbers across 3 years of censusing. So you can see that it's quite large in terms of all the other places that support piping plovers during the breeding season. These pie charts show how piping plover numbers move between water bodies in Saskatchewan across 3 censuses. And the take-home message here is that piping plovers move a lot in Saskatchewan. They use a lot of different water bodies. So what did the 2016 piping plover census tell us? Saskatchewan observers counted almost 800 birds and a little over 280 pairs of piping plovers. For comparison, in 2011, we had 778 birds and 195 pairs. So the piping plover numbers in 2016 increased 3% from 2011, and the pairs of piping plovers increased 44%. So there were more breeding attempts going on in 2019. Plovers were also found at 49 of 162 basins surveyed, and 39 of those 49 basins supported breeding pairs of piping plovers. In 2016, we had 6 new breeding areas that were discovered during the census, and piping plovers were found at 3 historic sites that had not been previously surveyed by the census. So we had an increase in breeding pairs in 2016, and it might be attributed to a rebound in piping plover use at Lake Diefenbaker. So let's take a look at Lake Diefenbaker. This is a table with a lot of numbers, and it shows the Water Security Agency's efforts to monitor piping plovers on the shores at 2 locations on Lake Diefenbaker, which I want to remind you is not a lake. It's a reservoir. Lake Diefenbaker is actually a flooded section of the South Saskatchewan River, which they fill with water or drain seasonally each year. And in order to do this, they have to follow some pretty strict guidelines on monitoring the piping plover populations there. And sometimes they have to physically move the nests up the beach. Now, I want to draw your attention to the total piping plover numbers in the far right column. And you'll notice that these numbers fluctuate across the years, starting from 2005 and going down to 2019. And 2019 was not great for piping plover numbers. But if you look at those numbers and keep in mind that in 1991, the IBA for Canada, those important bird areas, noted that Lake Diefenbaker had the highest number of piping plovers across their range, which was 227 birds. So you can see that they're doing a pretty good job here at Lake Diefenbaker preserving the population, because we've hit 200 and we're in the high 100s through a number of years there. So they're doing okay. Now I'm going to briefly go over some of the research and monitoring and conservation programs that have taken place with piping plovers in Saskatchewan. The research and monitoring includes water level management, mainly at Lake Diefenbaker, reproductive success, which measures things like nest and chick survival, predator exclosures. You can see a couple of photos of the fact that the birds do indeed use those exclosures. They can get right through that mesh. We also have nest relocation, cattle management, landowner stewardship programs, which I'll talk about a bit more, and grassroots volunteer efforts that are helping conserve piping plovers in Saskatchewan. The person in these photos is actually moving a nest at Lake Diefenbaker. So let's talk a bit about the stewardship programs. Nature Saskatchewan has a program called Plovers on Shore that was initiated in 2008. In this program, landowners enter an informal handshake agreement These agreements are non-legally binding and they can be ended at any time. Landowners with shoreline habitat on their land often know if they have piping plover with more accuracy than the experts or the bird watchers, who may or may not have access to the prime habitat on private land. Participating landowners keep track of piping plovers by sending us their observations on a census card, an example of which is in the lower left-hand corner of the screen here at the end of the breeding season. And as part of Plovers on Shore, Nature Saskatchewan has developed beneficial management practices that provide site-specific recommendations. Basically, those recommendations are small changes and tweaks to the existing management practices, because if piping plovers are on these landowners' land, it's because they're doing something right. Nature Saskatchewan also offers a habitat enhancement program for landowners who have usually shoreline next to pastures as opposed to crops, or confirmed sightings of piping plovers breeding on their land, and sometimes their land is even critical habitat. In these programs, Nature Saskatchewan will offer a 50% payment for costs that include projects that use things like alternative cattle watering systems that allow the cows to access water instead of going down to the shoreline where piping plovers are breeding, as well as fencing projects that use wildlife-friendly fence, which have a barbless lower line of fencing there. You can see that in the upper picture on the screen here. And these fences can be used to sort of corral the cattle down into a very narrow access to those wetlands if there are piping plovers breeding there. So what else can we do to conserve piping plovers in Saskatchewan? We can avoid beaches where there are signs or where it's known that piping plovers are nesting, and we can try to keep our pets on a leash in those areas. We can also avoid the fun that we have rolling around in our ATVs and our recreational bikes and things like that on beaches where we know that there are piping plovers. And we can clean up the garbage that sometimes can attract predators and scavengers to those beaches. And we can volunteer. So there are a lot of different kinds of programs that exist, or some things that citizens can do on their own. For example, you can visit lakes and wetlands on your land and note if there are piping plovers there, and then conserve that habitat in your own management practices. You can also get involved in your children's classrooms and educate the next generation about piping plovers. They're pretty charismatic little creatures to throw up on a screen, and most kids will go home singing their praises to their parents and potentially learn a bit more from their parents, because landowners, as I said, tend to know a lot about the species at risk that are on their land. And you can also volunteer for Nature Saskatchewan's Naturehood program. You just go online to our website and there's a whole bunch of information available there. So overall, protecting piping plover habitat protects habitat for other wildlife species as well. And we've got red knots and long-billed curlew, as well as a tiger beetle, and I'm going to fail you on the plant there. I want to just take a moment to recognize the sponsors that help Nature Saskatchewan, and then I would like to thank you and take any questions.
Shirley, thank you so much. That was such an awesome presentation. We have a couple questions here from our listeners, and to all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. And if you have any questions for Shirley, please feel free to write it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. So Shirley, our first question is from a listener named Bianca, and she would like to know, are there any morphological differences between adult male and female piping plovers?
Bianca, I have to make a comment here. I am not an expert when it comes to piping plovers. I'm making this presentation because I am a member, or I'm in charge of the Habitat Stewardship Coordinator program here, and Plovers on Shore is one of my programs. But I think that there are not morphological differences between the female and the male. And I mentioned in the presentation that it's often hard to tell them apart, especially because they share the incubation duties. A lot of the times with other bird species, you can find one on the nest and say, that's probably the female. In this species, they are both up and about and hunkered down on the nest. So as far as I know, it's very difficult to tell the male and the female apart.
Thank you for that answer. A listener named James would like to know, when is the next Saskatchewan census?
The next Saskatchewan census is going to be in 2021, and we're preparing for that now, hoping to get funded through the Habitat Stewardship or Habitat through a big grant that we're working on right now.
That's great. How can people get involved with the census, or how exactly does it work?
They would need to give Nature Saskatchewan a call, and we would be able to hook them up with any volunteers that want to be involved, and we'll have specific volunteer duties. There are also going to be opportunities for them to go online and sign up that way as well. It's going to be just a little while, though, before that's available online. They can definitely go online and read about it and find out what kinds of volunteer opportunities have been offered in the past and think about which of those they would like to take part in.
Excellent. Thanks for that answer. There's a couple questions here about piping plovers and killdeers. Could you tell us what the difference is exactly between piping plovers and killdeer?
Yeah, that's one that's definitely difficult for a lot of folks. I'm going to say first off that if you have what looks like a plover nesting in your garden or in a place where it's pretty close to your farmyard or in a developed area like along a road or some of them nest in parking lots, that's most likely a killdeer. The piping plovers have a really specific nesting habitat preference. It needs to be a shoreline. It needs to have those fine gravels and sands. There needs to be a certain distance between the water and the edge of the beach where the vegetation leads off. So if you're seeing a bird that has a neck ring and it's on a beach, it is more likely to be a piping plover than if you're seeing a bird with a neck ring that is near your home. The other thing is that piping plovers and killdeer have two very different calls. I'm going to play a piping plover call. There's a little bit of background noise here, but they basically say people, people. So listen to this. This is piping plover. So that's a piping plover, and if you hang on just a second, I noticed that I talked really, really fast, and so I think I have time to play a killdeer, which is really, really distinct, and it's a very, very different call. So give me just 2 seconds here, and I will help you hear a killdeer call. The other thing that you can keep an eye out for killdeer is that they have a fairly obvious double neck ring. So it's not a single neck ring, it's a double neck. It looks like they're wearing a necklace and a collar. And so the killdeer is also taller and quite a bit more brown. Okay, here's a killdeer song. So that's pretty distinct. Generally in the breeding season, you'll be able to hear them singing or calling. And if you hear a hippo, then that's a snowy, or sorry, that's the piping plover. And if you hear something saying killdeer, then that's a killdeer. I don't mean to make that sound obvious because it's something that's difficult if you're just catching a flash of the song or a very brief sighting of the bird. I hope that helps.
Yes, so just to confirm, I'm taking notes here, Shirley. So
Okay.
killdeers are found usually near people's gardens or houses or on the road. That's where you're more likely to see them, whereas piping plovers are more likely to be seen along water. And the killdeer has a double ring, and then of course that call. Now there's a couple people asking. About the broken wing display. So do both piping plovers and killdeer do the broken wing display?
You know, that's a good question. I would say yes, they do. I believe I've seen a killdeer do that same kind of a wing dragging behavior. I think it's more well known with piping plovers because they live in pretty open habitat and they don't have a really, really loud call. And when a killdeer is trying to draw your attention away from a nest or away from their babies, they may well flutter off into the bushes, but they'll also be screaming at you, killdeer, killdeer, and they're quite distracting. So I would say yes, both of them probably have a wing dragging display. There are other species of birds as well that do conspicuous physical movements to draw attention away from their young or their nest. But it's definitely something that the piping plover do, and I wouldn't be surprised if killdeer did it as well.
Thanks, Shirley. One of our listeners with the username T Makanaki, hopefully I pronounced that right, has written in that this person has done work with plovers in Manitoba, and they said a killdeer is twice the size with the two neck rings, and that they actually do the display as well. So both birds do it, which is why it's so confusing to tell the difference between these two birds. So that's interesting. Thanks for writing that in, T. Makonaki. Pardon my pronunciation. We have a listener here named Cheryl who says, I used to work with piping plovers around Lake Diefenbaker in 2007. At the time, we were having a hard time getting farmers involved with the program. What level of participation do you have with your program?
So I can answer that for Nature Saskatchewan. Nature Saskatchewan's programs. I definitely can't speak to the farmers out at Lake Diefenbaker, although we do have a few farmers, a few landowners who have land that abuts or comes right up to the edge of Lake Diefenbaker. I think that we have, I would say, a lot less problem getting landowners interested in our Plovers on Shore program than we do, say, for burrowing owls, for which there's quite a bit of mythology and fear associated with. But most of the landowners that we have signed up in our Piping Plover program, Plovers on Shore, need a little bit of hand-holding and training and confirmation about what these birds look like. And once they get the search image down, and once they can tell them from other small breeding shorebirds around the shoreline, then they're really enthusiastic. That's pretty much the trend that I would say. Landowners, farmers, cattle ranchers, they love their species at risk. And when they learn that they have a likelihood or species at risk present on their land, they're really proud. And they should be, because that means they're doing something right. These birds are endangered, and if someone has these birds on their land, that's a huge feather in their cap, and they should be really proud because they're supporting habitat that supports a species at risk, an endangered species at risk. And many of our participants are very proud of that. So I wouldn't say we have trouble signing them up. A lot of the times, if we have trouble, it will be because they have cattle down on the shoreline, but just a little bit of descriptions about timing and a mention of our habitat enhancement programs that will share 50% of the cost of putting in some fences to sort of contain the cattle access to those shorelines can be pretty encouraging to those folks.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Thanks, Shirley. A listener named Sheila would like to know, and I'm not sure if you know this or not, are piping plovers still being banded at Lake Diefenbaker?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if they are or not. That would be a question for Corey White, who's in charge of that program out of the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency. But if this person wants to get in touch with me by emailing me at outreach@naturesask.ca, I can certainly follow up with her and get that information for her.
Perfect, thank you. A listener named Maddie would like to know if the Plovers on Shore program uses any of the Canadian Agriculture Partnership programming.
Wow, that's a really good question. Again, back to back. I'm gonna have to get back to them with that. Please email me. To my knowledge, Nature Saskatchewan has in the past partnered with the Ministry of Agriculture in various programs that will increase the ability of landowners who are interested in the Plovers on Shore program, making it more financially, logistically possible to conserve habitat for piping plovers. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that we kind of lumped our collaboration with other organizations that have programs that help landowners conserve that habitat.
Thanks, Shirley. It looks like there's one last question here. A listener named Annabelle would like to know if one of the breeding pairs dies, would the other bird raise the chicks?
That's a great question. That kind of leads into some really interesting reproductive biology that I had to slice out of my talk, sadly, because it was pretty long. Yes, the answer to that is if one of the pair of the piping plovers dies, the remaining piping plover will indeed take care of the chicks. Quite often, what happens is that the female, after the chicks are off the nest and feeding on their own along the shoreline, the female will scarper off and start another clutch with another male. And she will increase her breeding success or her reproductive success that much more by making more babies. And mainly it's the male piping plover that sort of shepherds the babies around later in the period where they're growing and just up to the time where they fledge. He will be mainly the one who is helping those babies. If the female has an opportunity to start a new clutch with another male, then she will, and she will happily increase the number of piping plover babies. But I would say that sort of ties into the possibility of what would happen if one of them was unable to look after their babies. The other one would step in and be sure to take care of them.
That's so sweet. Thanks for sharing, Shirley. Carmen said that there used to be plover's nests at Fishing Lake, which is north of Foam Lake, when she was a kid. Do you know if they're still there? Like, are there still plover's nests there?
This is a heartbreaking question. We have, first of all, I have to say I don't know, because I don't know where Carmen's land, where exactly that nest was. But I will say that our 2019 Plovers on Shore census results from a number of different participants along Fishing Lake came back with results that there was no shoreline at Fishing Lake at all. So I tried not to get too negative about agricultural draining, but in many instances, there's a lot of water being pumped into the larger water bodies. And the result is that the shorelines disappear. So what I know about Fishing Lake in 2019 is that there was no habitat for or very little, much reduced habitat for piping plovers there. I'm sorry, that's a terribly sad way to end this. Does anyone else have another question?
Oh, that's really too bad to hear. Are there things like, is there something going on for the broader landscape about agricultural draining to prevent this from happening? Do you know of any like political changes or policy changes?
Well, there are some proposed changes afoot at the Water Security Agency. And I know that there was a big workshop that was that gave folks who are interested in those changes the opportunity to voice some concerns about those policies. But I think that in order to answer that question, people should really go online and take a look at the proposed policy changes on the Water Security Agency website.
Thanks, Shirley. There's another question that came in from a user named T. McNaughey. And this person says, Saskatchewan Water Authority is planning a big watershed drainage pilot program. Is Nature Saskatchewan able to participate in that program as a stakeholder? Do you know anything about that?
What was the name of the organization again? Sorry?
Saskatchewan Water Authority.
Okay. Yeah, I have heard about that, and I think that we are involved in it. I think that it's preliminary right now, and I don't know exactly when it's going to take place, but I know that Nature Saskatchewan is aware of it and has been invited to take part. I'm not sure if we're taking part as a stakeholder. I'm sure that there are plenty of landowners that have a bit more of a stake in that than we do, but I think we're aware of it, and we are going to be involved. I don't know to what extent, but it's definitely on our radar.
Thanks, Shirley. How many broods will a pair of piping plovers raise during the summer?
That's a really good question. I think it has a lot to do, or the answer has a lot to do with how many of the broods are successful. So if you have a male and female who have their first clutch together and that clutch is destroyed for one reason or another, they will start another clutch right away, usually in a different location. And as I mentioned, if the female is able to get away after her eggs have hatched and start another clutch, that could happen as well. So I would say it's probably pretty likely that there's potential for two. Even if the first clutch survives, there's potential for two. The answer to that question also really depends on the circumstances, both climate circumstances and water level changes at the nesting shoreline. If you have a really wet summer, they might try quite a few clutches if the eggs just aren't hatching, if it's too cold, or if the babies don't survive. If the water rises and one nest is inundated, they will definitely try a second clutch. So if everything goes great and it's a nice long warm summer, I wouldn't be surprised if they were able to get two, if that one female was not able to have two nests, and if she was lucky, she might be able to fledge as many as 7 or 8 chicks, all things being perfect. So maybe 2 clutches. I'm sure there are exceptions to that. There might be more, and the average might be a bit lower.
Okay, thanks. A couple more questions have popped in here. In Manitoba, are piping plovers on the endangered list?
They're on the endangered list in Canada throughout their range. So that includes Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, as well as Ontario and Quebec and into the eastern seaboard. So they're endangered right through all of their range throughout Canada.
Thank you. And do you know if the most recent piping plover census is available for the public?
The results of the 2016 census?
Where would someone access that?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it would be great if it was. I think, again, if it were available, it might be available through Nature Saskatchewan. And so if a person wanted to go to our website and flip through the various pages, I'm sure they could find reference to it, and there might be a listing of the data, a summary of the data. I'm pretty sure there's a text summary of it available, and it's discussed as well in our end of year report.
And I know PCAP did a Native Prairie Speaker Series webinar about it as well, probably been back in 2017.
Right.
Do you know if killdeers are a listed species?
Well, I know that killdeer migrate, and so they are they are protected under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. They're not considered a pest species the way things like vultures and some owls are, surprisingly. Those species are covered under the Saskatchewan Wildlife Act, protected under the Saskatchewan Wildlife Act. I think killdeer are protected mainly under the Migratory Bird Convention Act, but they are not listed as a species at risk either federally on the Species at Risk Act, and they are not listed as a wildlife species at risk either in Saskatchewan. But I do believe that they have protection through the Migratory Bird Convention Act, and there may be protection of their habitat if they are in a nesting phase. I think that it would be illegal to remove or destroy a nest simply because they're a migratory bird species.
Thanks. And listener T. Makanaki wrote in again that they are piping plovers are on Manitoba's provincial endangered species list as well, in addition to the
Excellent
protection too.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Manitoba is definitely a proactive conservation province.
Yeah. So Shirley, piping plovers seem to be such an amazing bird. What is your favorite thing about them?
I grew up on beaches where sanderlings were common, and so I just love tiny birds running like faster than I could run and chasing the edges of waves and pecking things off the beach. I love the fact that they're visually vigilant. Their eyes are huge and they're able to see little tiny bugs. And I guess I just like that. I like how active they are, and I love their cryptic eggs. I think their eggs are wonderful. They're shaped in such a way that if they roll, they tend to roll in a tight little circle and not roll out of the nest, which can be kind of flat. So I guess they've got some adaptations that I really appreciate. Their big eyes and their visual vigilance and their babies and their eggs cryptic coloration. But I really love how they run around like tiny crazy people.
Thanks, Shirley. Thanks for that answer. A listener's wondering if this presentation will be available offline, and the answer is yes. You can go to the PCAP YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/user/skpcap. We'll also have a link to that through the PCAP website as well. And it looks like all the questions that we have, and there's been a few listeners that have written in that say this was a very informative presentation, and thank you. So I guess with that, I'll just reiterate their comments here, Shirley. So thank you very much for taking the time to share your knowledge and this wealth of information and all of your experience with wildlife and the Piping Plover program. So, and thank you for the amazing work that you're doing to protect this endangered species.
Thank you, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Shirley. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you can catch our Native Prairie Speaker Series in February about grassland birds. Just a note, when you leave the presentation, there'll be a survey that'll pop up. If you don't mind filling that out, that'll help us give feedback to our sponsors so we can continue doing this in the future. So with that, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.